My assumption was that when Reagan left, the Republican Party would spin out of control. What I didn't realize then, or at least what I think now, is that Reagan still runs the Republican Party. It's as if the man never died.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
More than 30 years after his inauguration as the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan's vision continues to shape the Republican Party.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
He was a stalwart in the conservative movement. He was genial, he was likable, he was popular with the voters.
A Washington outsider, often called the great communicator, Reagan spent more than 2 decades honing his rhetoric against the federal government and communism.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask...
Ronald Reagan was both a Cold Warrior and a master diplomat. It's possible to be very, very tough-minded, to believe in peace through strength, as he put it, to believe in power, and to be a good diplomat.
The choices were very obvious, either between big or small government, either between freedom and dictatorship, either between America or the Soviet Union.
We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
When people name the figures who were transformative, that is to say, they did more than just occupy the office, but actually changed the direction of the country in some ways, Ronald Reagan would be one of those.
The fact that he was largely successful is allowed the folklore of Reagan to rise to very high proportions in the 21st century. He's seen like FDR as a president who was very polarizing in their time, but who has become beloved by the general public.
His whole life had been a series of very improbable things, going from being a radio announcer to a movie star, going from being a movie star to governor of California, going from a failed presidential bid to becoming a very successful president.
Was he a man of simple conviction? Was he a hypocrite who preached his faith in God but never went to church? Was he a man who preached tax cuts but then increased taxes?
On the one hand, he came in talking about fiscal cutting the federal government. On the other hand, he had the largest federal deficits in history in a non-war period.
During the 8 years Ronald Reagan occupied the White House, legislative battles were won and lost. Taxes went down and up. The Cold War neared the end. The war on terror began. And today, issues battled and fought during the Reagan presidency continue to shape American politics and government.
From a city on a hill to the wondrous generosity of the American people, Ronald Reagan imagined all that. He imagined a history of the United States which wasn't true, and then he made it happen. It was astounding that he could do that.
The farm fields of the Midwest are more than 1,500 miles from Hollywood. Yet to Ronald Reagan, the former actor and governor of California, the heartland was home. Reagan's third campaign for the presidency began with a loss in the Iowa caucus. To win the nomination, he had to defeat Republican Senators Howard Baker and Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush, a former congressman and CIA director who criticized Reagan's economic policies throughout the primaries. Over the years, opponents in both parties had challenged his ideas and his intellect.
The left refused to believe that Reagan was a heavyweight. And so Reagan had the advantage of always exceeding expectations.
He acted president. I don't know whether he knew what he was talking about half of the time, but he was so convincing.
Here was an actor, a former governor, but a former actor. Did he have the gravitas, people asked? Well, it turned out, surprisingly, he did have a lot of gravitas. And people began saying, well, maybe he can be president of the United States.
By 1980, this was a seasoned presidential candidate, a seasoned politician who'd governed the most populous state and who had run against some of the most formidable Republican challengers in the nation.
Ronald Reagan overtook his rivals and accepted the GOP nomination in July 1980.
Thank you very much.
His next task was to challenge the Democratic incumbent, President Jimmy Carter. Two weeks after accepting the nomination, the candidate waded into controversy with his first post-convention speech.
And to restore to states and local communities those functions which properly belong there.
Chills ran up and down my spine when he went to Philadelphia, Mississippi. They could have gone to New Orleans. They could have come to Atlanta. They could have gone almost anywhere in America but Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Memphis.
To many Americans, Philadelphia, Mississippi was a symbol of the civil rights movement and the brutal murder of 3 civil rights workers during the summer of 1964. But Reagan's speech endorsed his belief in states' rights, not civil rights.
As a historian looking at it, I find it to be the low moment of Reagan's political career.
It wasn't an ideal place for a conservative politician to begin his presidential campaign in 1980. There was some symbolism there that was offensive to many Americans.
It was a clear message to the reactionaries and to the racists of America that they were going to be back in charge.
While the speech alienated many African Americans and civil rights proponents, some believe it helped Reagan gain support from Southern conservatives in both parties. Presidential campaigns move quickly, and in his battle with incumbent President Jimmy Carter, Reagan returned to the themes that had propelled him through the primaries.
That Carter record is a litany of despair, of broken promises, of sacred trusts abandoned and forgotten.
Reagan's attacks on Carter focused on a faltering economy, but the crisis that engulfed Carter's presidency played out thousands of miles to the east. Revolution had toppled the regime of the controversial ruler of Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi. Muslim cleric Ruhollah Khomeini assumed control of the longtime U.S. ally.
As the revolution occurred, the Shah left the country. The U.S. is put in a dilemma, how to deal with its former ally. Originally, the Khomeini government sought to have neutral relations with the United States.
Any hope of neutral relations went out the window quickly. While living in forced exile, the Shah sought treatment for cancer in the U.S. Carter faced one of the toughest decisions of his presidency.
The decision to admit the Shah to the United States for medical treatment was hugely controversial. We tried to make clear to the Iranians that this was purely humanitarian.
The Shah was allowed to receive medical treatment in New York City. As he recovered from surgery, protesters massed outside his hospital room. But the most powerful opposition played out in Iran, where student militants stormed the U.S. Embassy.
A group of students were marching in front of the American embassy in Tehran when suddenly they ran towards the gate, jumped over the walls, and seized the embassy and its staff. What followed was 444 days of a hostage crisis that gripped the imaginations of all Americans.
Historically, I think it was the first explosion of the new generation of Islamic radicalism.
More radical students on the left conspired to take the U.S. Embassy and the American diplomats there hostage to be able to put pressure on the United States to give up the Shah so that he would have to come back to Iran and stand trial.
The hostages became pawns in the domestic political struggle for Khomeini to consolidate total power for the new regime.
52 Americans were being held hostage, and in the minds of many voters, so was the Carter presidency.
It was a horrible moment for us, but for the whole world of diplomacy, because diplomatic immunity is a fundamental principle that allows an embassy to be in a land where maybe the country is hated.
Carter's approach to the standoff and to the new leadership in Iran generated considerable controversy. Reagan took advantage of the crisis as he pressed voters on pocketbook issues. Gas prices had skyrocketed. The unemployment rate had reached 7.5%. The prime interest rate was above 15%. But the real culprit was what economists called stagflation, the combination of stagnant economic growth combined with high unemployment and inflation.
We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well.
At the White House, months of failed diplomacy with Iran had been scuttled in favor of a military effort called Operation Eagle Claw.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it.
While prepping the assault team, a crash occurred in the desert. 8 American servicemen were killed, all with no resistance from Iranian forces. When Carter and Reagan squared off in their only televised debate, many pundits suggested that Reagan exceeded expectations.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Then Governor Reagan offered very simple solutions, both at home and abroad, and this positive kind of upbeat personality, and that's what made the difference.
Americans were more cynical about politics than they were in the 60s, and that was largely because of the intervening period of Watergate and the Nixon administration. But the big problem in the late 70s was inflation, runaway inflation, double-digit inflation, and Americans are worried most of all about their own pocketbooks.
Many voters did not agree with Ronald Reagan's stance on social issues. Gun control, abortion, school prayer. He opposed the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1980 race. But they didn't vote on those issues. Reagan helped reframe the overall political debate in the United States in a way that brought voters who opposed him on those kind of gut social issues to his side.
Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan by more than 9% in the popular vote. Republicans also gained control of the Senate for the first time in a generation.
The 1980 election was the birth of a new, muscular, self-confident, conservative philosophy which believed in deregulation, lower taxes, less government, and it dominated American politics really for the next 2 or 3 decades.
Inauguration Day for the new president coincided with the release of American hostages.
Even after he was defeated, Jimmy Carter worked overtime right up to the last minute to try to release these hostages. But the hostage takers waited until moments after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated before they finally released the hostages.
The new president never mentioned the hostages in his inaugural speech. Instead, Reagan focused on the themes that would define his domestic policy and approach to government.
But if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?
He seized on the old populism, the populism that had emerged in the 19th century in the Midwest. That is, that somebody is screwing us. It's the railroads, it's the banks, it's Wall Street, and it's big business. Ronald Reagan took that American populism and, in a brilliant political maneuver, reversed it, and instead of business being the enemy of ordinary people, government was the enemy, so that he turned the country against government.
Everything about the free enterprise system was good, and everything about government was bad. Of course, he didn't govern that way. He governed with a recognition that government had a role to play. But he mythologized the American free enterprise system.
Faith in government was in question, but the failing economy was not. The challenges were real, and many Americans were hurting.
A lot of people may have been unhappy, but they understood there was an inflation problem. They understood that restraining the money supply was a part of the cure, and I think President Reagan understood that.
While the Federal Reserve battled inflation with high interest rates, President Reagan stuck to the core beliefs that had helped him achieve victory. Less than a month into office, he outlined his recovery plans to Congress, unveiling an approach that came to be called Reaganomics.
I am proposing a comprehensive four-point program. This plan is aimed at reducing the growth in government spending and taxing, reforming and eliminating regulations which are unnecessary and unproductive or counterproductive, and encouraging a consistent monetary policy aimed at maintaining the value of the currency.
As Congress and the nation debated the merits of the president's plan, a young man from Texas changed the course of history.
Shots fired. Shots fired.
Just 2 months into office, President Reagan, Press Secretary James Brady, District of Columbia Officer Thomas Delahanty, and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy were shot by would-be assassin John Hinckley Jr. 4 people had been seriously wounded.
Roger, we want to go to the emergency room of George Washington. Go to George Washington fast.
The president was conveyed to George Washington University Hospital. His wife, Nancy, arrived quickly, as did the Washington press. As the public would find out later, the president's life was in grave danger. Yet even as doctors prepared for surgery, the president managed to keep the mood light.
Reagan looked up and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." And the doctor, who was a Democrat, actually said, "Today we're all Republicans, Mr. President." I mean, it was the story was right out of Hollywood.
He was a hero in the movies, but now he's a real hero. He survived this attack. And he did it with a style and grace that was uniquely Reagan.
Within 2 days, the press and the world watched as an elderly president began to recover like a man half his age. The stock market rallied, and the president's approval rating rose from 62 to 73%.
it certainly made him a much more difficult adversary for those of us who were trying to really steer the ship a little bit differently.
He gets shot. He survives, and he responds well to it. He's not angry, he's not sad. It really did endear people to him, and it also reassured them.
The White House brilliantly exploited the attempt on his life and his rapid recovery to give him a kind of larger-than-life presence, so that when he returned to Congress to give another speech for his economic program, he was greeted like a conquering hero, and Americans reached out to him.
There are still almost 8 million unemployed.
An invigorated president spelled out the nation's economic challenges, then set a course that would mark his presidency.
The answer to a government that's too big is to stop feeding its growth.
As his initiatives worked their way through Congress, Reagan made history when he followed up on a campaign promise to voters.
It had been 191 years since our country formed, and no woman had served on the court.
I pledge to appoint a woman who meets the very high standards that I demand of all court appointees.
He was very much impressed with Sandra Day O'Connor. She had been a legislator, so she knew the policy world. She had also been an important rancher, so she knew business. And then, most important, she had been a very good judge on the appellate court in Arizona.
I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
It was not a position to which I aspired. I was a Republican. I was presently serving as a judge, and there weren't too many Republican women judges. There weren't too many women judges, period.
We couldn't get the Equal Rights Amendment, we couldn't get equal pay, we couldn't get anything else, but maybe we'll get our nose under the tent.
Sandra Day O'Connor and the president met for just 40 minutes prior to her nomination to the court.
He was very careful to appoint judges that he felt would carry out the constitutional role of a judge. That is, to interpret the law and apply the law, not to make the law.
The president didn't ask me to make any promises about anything.
The nomination was not without controversy. There were objections from some notable conservatives, especially those who viewed O'Connor as moderate on abortion rights.
With this nomination, this administration has in effect said to the pro-family activists, goodbye. We don't need you, we don't want you, we don't care about you.
The subject of abortion is a valid one, in my view, for legislative action, subject to any constitutional restraints or limitations.
Still, Justice O'Connor's nomination passed the Senate on a unanimous vote.
Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost.
During the presidential campaign, Reagan had declared his support for unions. He also had a history as a union member.
I respect the right of workers in the private sector to strike. Indeed, as president of my own union, I led the first strike ever called by that union.
But when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, known as PATCO, failed to agree to a new contract with the Federal Aviation Administration, union members decided to strike, and the president reacted.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being.
This issue is bigger than just the threats of the government. Is a much bigger issue to our people. We will not go back to work.
The air traffic controllers had no right to strike. They were a public employee union. Not only did they have no right to strike, but a strike of air traffic controllers was very dangerous for the country. So they essentially dared Ronald Reagan to pull the plug on them and fire them. And what did Ronald Reagan do? he pulled the plug on them and he fired them.
If they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
More than 11,000 union members soon found themselves unemployed.
Many employers interpreted Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers as a kind of public license, a kind of public legitimacy to go boldly, dramatically, and publicly after unions in a way that many employers had been reluctant to do before.
It wasn't a notch in Reagan's belt in the sense that that's why he did it. But it was evidence that Reagan would take a position and would stick with it. And that was something that was very good for him as a politician.
The president also stuck to his position on tax cuts. His smile cut through a thick morning fog as he signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 in the setting of his California ranch. The new legislation reduced marginal tax rates for individuals by 23% over 3 years.
And this is the tax program. They represent an end to the excessive growth in government bureaucracy and government spending, government taxing.
Crafted by Republican Congressmen Jack Kemp and William Roth, it was the first and most significant tax cut of the Reagan presidency. Roth later remarked, these tax cuts laid the foundation for the longest peacetime expansion in U.S. history.
The tax reduction, people forget this, became bigger than what he proposed, as it was kind of a competition in the Congress. Once we were going to have a tax reduction, the Democrats wanted to get some credit for it too. And that probably helped send interest rates as high as they did, because you had a clash between monetary restriction and growing budget deficits.
Whether tax cuts can stimulate the economy is still being debated. Not everyone in the administration was making that case in October '81, when the White House acknowledged that the United States was in a recession.
The recession of 1981-82 was as deep as the Great Recession that began in 2007-2008. Ronald Reagan essentially said, let the free market do what it will, precisely at a time when typical Americans were starting to struggle harder than they'd ever struggled in the 30 years after the Second World War.
It was a result of the Federal Reserve deciding it had to wring inflation out of the economy, and they raised interest rates up to close to 20%, and that produced very significant unemployment in America.
Unemployment hit 10.8% by the end of 1982, the highest in post-World War II history. The prime interest rate peaked at more than 20%. The recession was more than slight for many Americans.
I had a lot of criticism from the Treasury at that point and from people in the White House, but not from the president himself.
Inflation, high interest rates, and more than 10 million people out of work. The president's tax cuts meant less revenue, and the president initiated decreases to many federal programs in an effort to offset a growing federal deficit. But the president also continued the themes of his inaugural address by asking Congress for increased military spending.
President Reagan had the right idea in terms of scaling the government, but the pain needed to be even-handed.
His military spending was so big that it pumped up the economy, just the way John Maynard Keynes would have suggested pumping up the economy, not because of supply-side tax cuts, but because of government spending.
It truly was military Keynesianism, and Reagan was a true believer in it. And it had the dual purposes of short-term keeping jobs going, but also taking it to the Soviet Union. Reagan was never going to cut any federal program that was going to help win the Cold War.
It's true that the defense budget went up and the non-defense discretionary budget went down, but that had nothing to do with supply-side economics.
But by late 1981, tax revenues and government spending weren't adding up. and what some had called supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics, or simply Reaganomics, was challenged by Reagan's White House budget director, David Stockman.
But we obviously need mid-course corrections.
I knew that David Stockman was a skeptic that the tax cuts would lead to adequate economic growth that would eliminate the deficits. He gave his famous on-the-record interview to a journalist from the Atlantic Monthly, where he basically confessed that the whole Reagan scheme was built on a fiction.
Reporter William Grider quoted Stockman saying, "None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers." Stockman also referred to the general tax cut as, quote, "a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate." Still, not everyone took Stockman or his claims seriously.
David Stockman meant nothing to Ronald Reagan. He was some smart kid in striped pants, probably called him Dave or Dan in the hall. You know, it's the left who made a big deal out of Stockman when he bolted from Reagan.
There was this internal conflict between some of the extreme supply-siders and folks like Dave Stockman and myself, who believed in lower tax rates and lower government spending, but didn't think that that was going to produce miracles.
The idea was simple enough. Tax cuts would motivate investment and personal spending. Job growth would follow. Revenues would go up, and the budget would balance. Public reaction was mixed.
Reaganomics, I would say, is probably not working.
If you take the highest unemployment since 1929, I would say President Hoover's back in the White House.
It's working for me. I hope it works for other people.
I do feel that that we're going to have to bite the bullet a bit, and that maybe it's going to be rough for a little while, but I feel like he's on the right track.
You can see by my shirt that I definitely believe that it's not working.
You have the same arguments now. You know, how much do we spend to boost the economy, which is also going to increase the debt? But tax cuts, Reagan believed, if you're going to increase deficits, tax cuts are the way to do it, not from government spending.
But David Stockman wasn't the only Reagan advisor to suggest that deficits challenged the success of the Reagan strategy.
The political advisors, they knew there was a fiscal deficit, but they didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't want me talking about it. The deficit, as a minimum, means that the government is borrowing funds that could otherwise be borrowed by the private sector and used for investment. So it means less investment. All of the good things that supply-side economics is supposed to be about on the investment side would be crowded out by excessive government borrowing.
Unemployment continued to hover above 10%. Many Americans were desperate. In Milwaukee, more than 15,000 people showed up to apply for just 200 job openings at a local manufacturing plant. The burden of cuts in social services and affordable housing often fell to cities, and some observed dramatic increases in homelessness.
The great civilization, which America is, has to be judged not by its richest, but by its poorest. And in those regards, Reagan seemed callous to this concept of homelessness. Reagan's view is homelessness and welfare, the individual has to take some responsibility for that. The government can't just keep doling out money for people. And if you think that that's cruel, fair enough, but then you have to criticize Bill Clinton too, who simply adopted Reagan's philosophy on welfare.
Statistics on homelessness are difficult to gather. During the 1980s, poverty rates hovered between 13 to 15%. As many as 500,000 people were living on America's streets by the late 1980s.
There were a lot of people hurting during those days. They weren't on Wall Street. They were on Main Street and the side streets of American cities. And poor people, or people without a social safety net, were being hurt by this.
During an ABC News interview, the president suggested that many people were homeless by choice. He added that the problem had been aggravated by issues on the state and local level.
It kind of is blind to those problems that are not solvable by the market, like disabled people or older people or homeless people or children who need education and are marginalized, or people who live in our toughest urban areas and so forth.
Within a year of passing the largest tax cut in American history, Congress and the President weren't able to balance the budget. Shortly before the President signed a tax increase into law, he referred to it as an adjustment.
To even have referred to this as a tax increase, I think was wrong, because it was an adjustment of the tax cut that was passed last year and which still continues on into the coming years.
This thing about Ronald Reagan never raised taxes is ludicrous. He raised taxes when the country needed to have taxes increased.
Human Events, a conservative publication admired by the President, called the, quote, adjustment the largest tax increase in history.
He began raising taxes, though he never used those words. He called it revenue adjustment of the tax cut bill.
What looked like a very affordable tax cut when it was first passed became clear when inflation came down was something we couldn't afford.
By the midterm elections in November, average Americans weren't the only casualties of tough economic times. With President Reagan's approval rating nearing the low point of his presidency, Republicans lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives. Democrats also won 27 of 36 gubernatorial races. Despite the election results, the economy was beginning to show signs of recovery. With inflation under control, borrowing became easier.
Paul Volcker and the Fed merely reversed course. They lowered interest rates, and people could borrow. Companies could borrow cheaply. People could buy more because they could get money cheaply. And that itself boosted the economy enormously.
Volcker had the courage to go through and do that, to push interest rates up to double-digit levels. That brought down the inflation rate much more quickly than anybody expected. And so there was a general recognition that that had been the right policy.
Speaker of the House of Representatives.
As the recovery continued, the President and Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill worked on a bipartisan approach to Social Security reform. The result, the Social Security Amendments of 1983, included a significant increase in the FICA payroll tax. It delayed cost of living increases and raised the retirement age from 65 to 67 over 40 years. From the time of the attempt on his life in 1981, First Lady Nancy Reagan had worried about the president's security. As a devoted husband, the decision to run for re-election was a difficult one.
My fellow Americans, it's been nearly 3 years since I first spoke to you from this room.
But for Ronald Reagan, there were many goals yet to achieve.
I am therefore announcing that I am a candidate and will seek re-election to the office I presently hold.
The president began using every tool he had to persuade the American public, including his weekly radio address.
Industrial production has risen 14 straight months. Housing starts climbed 60% in 1983 to the highest level in 4 years. Retail sales surged. Auto sales registered their best year since 1979. And we had the steepest drop in the unemployment rate in more than 30 years.
As he had 4 years earlier, President Reagan seized on pocketbook issues. But this time, he rode a wave of economic news he could take credit for. Consumer confidence was high, and the unemployment rate had dropped nearly 3 points from its peak. Nearly 5 million jobs had been added to the economy. Still, the nation and the world faced significant issues. Reagan's tough stance on the Cold War helped Democrats court the growing anti-nuclear movement. They also seized on a frightening new public health issue. the president had largely downplayed a deadly crisis known as AIDS. Little was known about the disease in 1984, but it was believed to be sexually transmitted. And because the majority of reported victims were homosexual, faulty and sometimes reckless assumptions were made about the disease.
A lot of people died who didn't need to die. I don't think the governmental response was adequate to the problem because it didn't fit within our conception of the kinds of people we ought to be helping. They did this to themselves, their lifestyle, amorality, and so forth. Wrong way to think about this.
Democrats chose San Francisco as the location for their presidential convention, and many gay activists used the opportunity to bring attention to the AIDS crisis. The Democratic platform urged support for AIDS research and treatment, as well as protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation.
Why has this administration failed?
Walter Mondale beat several challengers for the nomination, and Democrats made history by choosing Geraldine Ferraro to share the ticket.
For Vice President of the United States.
The first Reagan years were a lot rougher than people remember. But then when the economy turned in '83 and on into the '84 election, it was clear the president had the upper hand.
The president may have had the upper hand, but Democrats played to his weakness. Since Reagan had assumed the presidency, the federal deficit had more than doubled from $79 billion in 1981 to $185 billion in 1984.
Perhaps the dominant domestic issue of our times is what do we do about these enormous deficits?
Mondale was running against a popular president by this point with no great mistakes under his watch, and with the economy rebounding. The president was light, joked, made fun of his age.
So I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
People expected Mondale, a very experienced political leader, meticulous in preparation, to handily win the debates. And he didn't.
Ronald Reagan went on to victory, beating the former vice president in a landslide.
I think that's just been arranged.
Reagan's domestic policy was the impetus for victory, and he played to those themes in his second inaugural address.
Tax rates have been reduced, inflation cut dramatically, and more people are employed than ever before in our history.
With the U.S. economy rebounding and a new leader emerging in the Soviet Union, much of the president's attention in the second term shifted to foreign policy. But there was one group of Americans whose struggles mounted despite the economic recovery.
This country is nothing without the farmer, and those who work the land have the right to know that there's a future in farming.
President Reagan had expressed his appreciation for farmers for years, and agriculture-related industries accounted for a significant portion of the gross national product. But family farmers were facing challenges not seen in a generation, and some viewed the president's messages as mixed. Faced with overproduction, a depressed market, and rising debt, many families pleaded for help to avoid foreclosure on their homes and their farmland.
We have gone further and further downhill until now our net worth is zero minus. We have nothing left that we can call our own.
Our profit picture has disappeared. We're getting a little over $2 and $5 for soybeans, and you just can't make it work.
Yes, we are sympathetic, and we will extend support. But American taxpayers must not be asked to bail out every farmer hopelessly in debt.
Dependence on government loans and subsidies was nothing new, but for this generation of farmers, the foreclosure crisis was. For some, the federal government was their last hope to preserve a lifestyle and legacy that had lasted since the nation's inception.
It's time for others to pitch in and do more. From officials at the state level to banks, private groups, and individuals in our communities, all joining in partnership to help farmers.
Some farmers organized, some fought back. Their protests were heard in Congress and at the White House. Congress and the President allocated $52 billion in aid to the beleaguered farmers, but the long-term impact on traditional family farming was considerable. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 farm businesses failed between 1980 and 1988. Facing a democratically controlled House, President Reagan embarked on what many consider his greatest bipartisan achievement.
The thing that we did that was most significant, where we were partners, was the 1986 Tax Reform Act that lowered tax rates from 50% to 28% for ordinary income and raised them for capital gains from 20 to 28%. The Tax Reform Act brought Democrats and Republicans together.
Flatter rates will mean more reward for that extra effort, and vanishing loopholes and a minimum tax will mean that everybody and every corporation paid their fair share.
Tax reform didn't necessarily mean more revenue to pay for increased federal deficits, but it did eliminate loopholes, broaden the tax base, and enhance a sense of fairness.
I feel like we've just played the World Series of tax reform, and the American people won.
Immigration, a contentious issue in the 21st century, was addressed by President Reagan just days after the midterm election. The president signed into law a sweeping reform of immigration policy that included amnesty for nearly 3 million undocumented workers.
It's the product of one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings in the last 3 Congresses. Further, it's an excellent example of a truly successful bipartisan effort.
I never hear President Reagan's name mentioned in the context of the present immigration debate, in part because I think the right doesn't want to acknowledge that he stood for the last amnesty. It sort of would fuzz the message of President Reagan as the conservative, and the left doesn't want to acknowledge his role because it would confuse things because they're so used to demonizing his policies.
As the former governor of California, the president had firsthand knowledge of the role undocumented workers played in his state's agricultural economy.
He's taking his cues from corporate America, and most business people in the 1980s said we would collapse without the cheap Mexican labor.
Reagan was forward-looking, I think, in terms of legislation, in terms of what he did, because he understood how important immigrants are.
The president recognized that it was in the American interest to have workers here at a time the economy needed them, and he was not driven by any, kind of cultural or anti-Latino vitriol of the kind that we see too often today.
I don't want to make it seem like Reagan's a great champion of Mexican workers' rights. Nevertheless, there was a compassion that he had to people that wanted to come to America for a better way of life.
A better way of life. During his inaugural address nearly 8 years earlier, President Reagan had laid out plans for a renewed America.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams.
Many would agree that he represented hope and that he helped to lift the nation out of the crisis of confidence described by his predecessor, Jimmy Carter.
I think his principal achievement, in a sense, was to change the mood of the country, coming into office at a time when people were feeling very sour about things, very uncertain.
Whether you agreed with his policies or not, there was a sense the United States was being led in a way that was strong and sure and in essential accordance with our basic principles.
I think sometimes Americans need a framework for understanding what government is doing and where we are going. I happen to disagree with Ronald Reagan's framework, but merely having it was something of an accomplishment.
Like all presidents, Ronald Reagan's domestic policy legacy is complex.
Ronald Reagan spoiled us. He told us we could have our cake and eat it too. I would say that history will say America became a spoiled child under Ronald Reagan. And we're having to pay the price of it now.
Anybody who's fair will tell you the American economy was much better in 88 and 89 than in 81. Hence what Reagan did short term for that generation of Americans was beneficial. What does that mean 100 years from now? Trends that Reagan started? That's why history is an ongoing process.
By the time the president left office, inflation was reduced to 4.7%. The prime interest rate had returned to 11%. Management of the environment under Interior Secretary James Watt was highly contentious, and consensus was never achieved on energy policy. By 1988, more than 82,000 cases of AIDS had been reported in the United States, resulting in more than 46,000 deaths. Military spending increased nearly 35% during Reagan's presidency, and he left behind the largest federal deficit in history up to that time. The president's bipartisan leadership and approach to tax reform was viewed by many as a plus. And for a president who pushed jobs whenever possible, his policies helped reduce the unemployment rate to 5.4%. He lost a Senate battle over Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork, but President Reagan did fill 2 additional Supreme Court vacancies with Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy. Reagan also made 384 appointments to the federal bench, the most of any president in history. Yet as much as Ronald Reagan changed the face of America's domestic policy, many believe his legacy is best articulated by his management of foreign policy.
Negotiation with the Soviet Union must never become appeasement.
What role did the president play in ending the Cold War?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
How was the Reagan administration impacted by policies in Central America and the Iran-Contra affair?
I authorized the transfer of small amounts of defensive weapons and spare parts for defensive systems to Iran.
What's the long-term impact of Reagan's decisions in the Middle East?
We didn't have a so-called war on terrorism, but we were fighting it nonetheless.